Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, coming at you live to talk about episode 23 of the anime series Sakurada Reset. And at least for me, I found this episode to be just as palpable and exciting as the previous episode, because in this episode, we're finally seeing the other leg drop as to what exactly Kei's plan of action is, how he's going to conduct himself, how he's going to carry it out, what that entails. And even though by and large all it seemed to entail was a lengthy conversation in the back of a car, a moving vehicle, this was his way of trying to persuade Urachi, or at least so we thought. That was the impression we had throughout the entirety of it until toward the three-quarter mark, when it's revealed that actually his modus operandi was something else. It was alternative to what the assumption was. And the whole idea of Tsushima being chosen to drive the vehicle, Kei having known in the alternate history before the reset that Tsushima would align himself with Urachi, and he sought to exploit that because he knows the kind of person Tsushima is. He knows better than even we, the viewer, because I was almost like, I found it very tentative and palpable that Tsushima is like, I'm going to stop the car. This is my boss in the back seat. Urachi is my boss, and I got to do what he says above what Kei says. And then Kei, it's not just that he's holding Urachi hostage, but he puts the knife on himself. And Tsushima rationalizes exactly what Kei's going to do 3 steps ahead of what Kei actually does. If need be, you'll keep the car moving because I'll kill myself. That kind of thing. I'll endanger myself. And in any other, frame of reference, framework in the real world, this probably would not have worked. But it does work to Kei's benefit. And I remember seeing a glimpse of that knife in the PV for this episode attached to the end of the previous. And I was like, uh-oh, is Urachi going to make good on his earlier seeming threat? Well, I'll just turn a knife on Kei if he becomes a problem. I was half expecting Urachi to grab the knife. And even at the end of the episode, when Urachi's saying, I don't like to shake hands, I'm almost waiting for him to draw a knife. And I'm just like, how would they even remotely get out of that scenario if suddenly Kei were to be killed? Thankfully, it didn't enter that framework at all. The ulterior motive on the part of Kei was not to persuade Urachi at all, as I say. And this gobsmacked me because of the attention they were calling to Kagaya, the lockdown guy, as I referred to him, because I could never remember his damn name. In the previous episode, there was a point where he pointedly looked at Kagaya, and I had then been left, while I was assuming watching the episode, and I touched upon this in my previous episode discussion video, I was assuming while watching it that it was something to do with Kei's words. It was why they, focused in on Kagaya's face, his expression. And then I was left thinking, oh, well, maybe it didn't have much to do with that, because in actuality, we found that Kei could, make him forget his ability. They were using the cat who can transfer abilities, and Okaeri's ability went into Kei, so he could lock down the memory of the lockdown guy, Kagaya, so he couldn't use that ability anymore. And so it was a very misdirective framework that now in this episode we call back on it again, and it turns out that I was both right and wrong. There was something to what Kei was saying in that moment. There was a focus on what his words were, what they amounted to, that calls back on this episode, and it very much revolves around the entirety of the conversation unfolding between Kei and Urachi to make Kagaya understand that Urachi will be forever unmoving, and he's unmotivated to even change his ways at the idea of removing the guilt from Kagaya that Kagaya still holds for having froze his father, locked down, Urachi's father those many years ago when he was still youthful, to keep the status quo of abilities within Sakurada contained thusly. And, basically it's Kei showing Kagaya the selfish nature of Urachi, what he seeks to do, how he seeks to hold everything and change everything for his own devices, no matter the cost. He doesn't even really care about his own family, his parents, who arguably are in suffering to maintain Sakurada the way it is. And it's Kei's outlook, well, why can't we sort of switch it up a little bit? And my presumption was, as I had voiced my own speculations in my previous episode discussion video, my thought was that maybe Kei would try to sacrifice himself But then the conversation turns on that tack. Well, what if you don't need to sacrifice a human being? We're not talking about swapping out, you know, Arachi's parents for a couple of other people or one singular other person. What if we use a cat? You know, and very much like Arachi, I'm sitting there, I'm like, I don't know if that's going to work. We haven't seen anything that's proven that fact. But then they talk about no, and you know, the cat girl and everything like that. And I'm like, that's right. She has a way to sense and kind of, you know, she's empathetic toward cats and can sense their feelings and where they are and all those kinds of things. So arguably, maybe there is room enough for that to be something that could be achieved. You know, use that idea of putting Kagaya's lockdown ability, you know, or rather exploiting it to put someone else's ability, like, you know, Arachi's father, into a cat, have him use the lockdown ability, and that would keep up the status quo without losing any human being, any person, swapping out any person, having to make a sacrificial act, as Arachi's parents did. And so it's quite, I'm like still trying to wrap my mind around, they're going to use a cat? You know, okay then, alrighty then. So, but we've seen the spectacular nature of all of these characters coming together and utilizing their powers as a team. We saw that in the previous episode, and again in this episode. Sasane turning the street, all told, into a giant, like, roller coaster slide. They're riding stolen bikes that Marase undoes the locks and everything like that, and it was absolutely hilarious, and I was, like, laughing my ass off. And it actually kind of reminded me, I watch the vlogger Adam the Woo, and there was a video he did, like, you know, a year ago or something, where he took a bike down a slide and he had a bad fall after that. It's like infamous now. You know, he still makes references to this day anytime he sees a slide. Oh, I wonder if anyone's ever taken a bike down that. Because he face planted. You didn't see it, you know, like where he actually fell, but you saw him going down the slide. And I was just heavily reminded of that. Because they're on bikes and they're going down what looks like a giant, you know, the road has become a giant slide. And so that was hilarious. Their getaway was spectacular. And again, like the whole crux of the episode is really just to, not even to persuade Arachi, but to persuade Kagaya and make him understand Arachi's mental position, that he's going to be unflinching, that he's not going to back down no matter what Kei tells him, no matter what he says. And when you found that, you know, like I was worried about Haruki that whole time because they're talking about, oh, well, we could take you into custody and everything like that. And then you see Kagaya come in and it's like, oh, you know, the lie detector chick is basically like, well, some things might not go according to Kei's plan, but it did. Everything went exactly to his plan. And I love that Haruki got to be so positioned that she was very significant in that moment. You know, she had to be there to kind of be the through line, you know, to explain what was happening, not only to we, the viewer, the audience, but in a sense to the lie detector chick, to Kagaya himself. She was kind of like the outward, you know, verbal quotient of explaining it away, because otherwise what Kagaya would have suddenly had was all these, you know, empathetic thoughts and vocalized thoughts coming into his head forcibly that he wouldn't have been able to make sense of necessarily. I mean, he probably would recognize, you know, oh, that's Kei and that's Arachi by voice, you know, that kind of thing. But that wouldn't necessarily have persuaded him had Haruki not been pinioned there at that exact moment to be like, this is what Kei's trying to put forth. This is why he's doing this. This is why he's sharing this information with you. And then they kind of, even though Kei, arguably once again, because of his interactions with the third photo Samir, he knows what's going to happen. He knows what the outcome will be. But they still give Kagaya the opportunity to feel as though it's his own choice. Because otherwise it would be, you know, he might then recoil thinking he's being manipulated, that kind of thing. And so it just overall, it was pretty spectacular. Seeing that intellectual sparring, that sort of, righteous sparring back and forth, verbally going back and forth between Kei and Arachi was once again just phenomenal. I love when they bound off each other like that, and that grand chess game unfolding between them. And in this case, it didn't lead where you might have assumed. And I liked that other leg dropped, and it was kind of surprising that no, in actuality, it wasn't Arachi at all Kei was trying to persuade. It was Kagaya, the lockdown dude. And it worked. It effectively worked. Now, after all is said and done, there's an end cap. And it is one that is somewhat shocking, especially with some of the sequences you see in the PV for the final episode of the season, which I believe is next week's episode, episode 24, involving Samir, whom I'm assuming is coming back into Sakurada. Like she had escaped for a time, and now she's coming back because she's talking about having lunch with Kei or whatever, and she's like primping her hair in the reflection of the subway window across the way and everything, or the train window, whatever it is. And suddenly there's like this emanation of power, which seems to be an inflooding of tons and tons of alternate memories and things that she experienced all across her different incarnations, her 3 different incarnations. The one that killed herself, this second, photo Samir, as I've dubbed her, and the third photo Samir. And it seems to be cacophonous to her mind. It's like a groundswell of all these revelations that in the end, she's left completely tanked. Whereas she's sitting happily, she's then lying on her side, crying, uttering apologies, realizing that maybe none of this was for Kei after all. And my initial sort of reaction to that, judging by, because I wound it back and I watched that whole sequence 2 more times, and then the PV as well, it seems to suggest to me that Samir's original concept of ending her own life was really her true motivation. But not because Kei would never choose her or look at her or feel romantically about her. I began to suspect that maybe Samir felt she couldn't be burdened with this ability of seeing the future anymore, of seeing all the possibilities, like, going back to that point where she was explaining and expressing how she's felt all her life, that she's never felt like a single human being, a singular person, because so much of her life is taken up with the minds and what's going on in the minds of others, and the possibilities and the capabilities and all those kinds of things. And the PV shows that there will be dialogue, I believe, from Kei saying, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. You see both Kei leaning over seemingly somebody and Haruki, they're both crying. And so I can only assume that Samir is going to die. And if it's not of her own choosing, then maybe it's as a consequence of her having returned to Sakurada and having that groundswell of experiences. Like maybe it messed her brain up. Like maybe it caused an aneurysm or something that is now irreversible. And that harkens back to Kei's overall, want to get her out of Sakurada. Maybe he knew. Maybe he was perceptive. Maybe he saw that when he dealt directly with the third photo Samir. And his hope then was locked down that she'd be forever displaced from Sakurada, even if it meant she'd have to sacrifice her memories of him, of abilities, of all that kind of stuff. If she stayed away, she'd be okay, but she came back. And I think this will make it something that cannot be undone, even with the reset, because now, at this point, we can't risk it. We can't risk resetting anymore, because look at everything that Kei just did. He can't go through that again and chance it not going to plan again. to solidify the sanctity of all of the abilities in Sakurada. So I think this might be the end for Samir. I think it's something that might be inescapable now, and that really kind of upsets me. But at the same time, if that does play out to be true, I can understand it given where we were left in this episode. And so, I mean, I'm not happy about it, but I understand it. And I guess it's just going to be left to see what that final episode yields for the culmination of this story, of all of these events. And, but again, this episode was pretty spectacular. I was on the edge of my seat. I was laughing. I was tentative through it, gritting my teeth like, oh man, what is going on? How is this, like a cat? We're going to put the ability into a cat and have Kagaya lock the cat down, and so that way human beings won't have to be sacrificed and such like that. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how they do culminate all of these story threads in the finale. And I'd love to hear from you guys what you thought of this particular episode in the comments below. Anything goes, just as long as we have a great conversation. Otherwise, it'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.